Hello and welcome. I'm Riz Khan in Washington, D.C., the capital of a nation that is still coming to terms with the outcome of the US elections. In this episode, we'll consider the implications for this divided country, for the Democratic Party, and for conflicts in the Middle East and beyond. First up, Arabiya's chief correspondent, Simon Marks, has seen it all during decades of covering the political beat in Washington. But he's never seen anything quite like this. So Simon, 8 elections you've now covered. How did this one compare with the previous ones?
Well, you know, Riz, I think that it is always said every 4 years that the United States is about to engage in the most important election of everybody's lifetime. And Americans are always told, you know, the future of the country depends on the outcome of this election. This time round, it had the added benefit of being true. Right? There is no question that this was the most important election any of us is ever going to cover because of the stakes. And the stakes are absolutely clear. We know that the Trump 2.0 administration is going to be much more radical. I mean, this is what they describe their plans to be than its predecessor, that he's learnt from what he thinks were the mistakes of the past, which was the coming to terms with people that didn't necessarily agree with him but brought expertise to the administration. So I think that it was always apparent that this was going to be an absolutely vital campaign. And a campaign that was elemental in terms of discussing the future of American democracy. And then the twists and turns, the departure of Joe Biden from the race, the drama of that, the injection of Kamala Harris being given 107 days to try and persuade Americans to get behind her. First of all, she had to introduce herself to them. Then she had to explain her policies to them. She was better at the first part than the second part. And it all culminated with the repudiation of Democrats, both in the battle for that building, but also in the battle for Congress, for the United States Senate.
So that's what I was wondering, with those twists and turns you just described, how difficult did it make your job? Because, of course, you're always expected to be on top of things, but, you know, you wake up and things have changed that morning.
Yeah, I mean, there's no campaign where everything goes according to plan for the two candidates, and indeed the whole concept of the October surprise, which is never that much of a surprise in recent years, exists to underscore the fact that this is always going to be a deeply, deeply unpredictable campaign. But a campaign in which you see the President of the United States succumb to a cabal by members of his own political party, orchestrated by one of his best friends, Nancy Pelosi, with whom Joe Biden has not spoken since he was defenestrated. The notion that we were going to watch his rival, Donald Trump, first of all defeat him in a television debate, then survive an attempted assassination that produced some of the most iconic images any American election has ever generated. You know, him getting back on his feet, the hand in the air, fight, fight, fight. The two conventions, always great images, you know, iconic images that come out of that. The Republicans leaving their convention in Milwaukee, absolutely convinced that they had this election in the bag because they were still at the time taking on Biden, then getting knocked on the back foot by Biden being replaced by Kamala Harris, then the attempted assassination, the attempted assassination, of course, happened before the Republican convention. All of these things brought together and underscored, I think, a really brittle sense in this country that the tension, the anxiety, just the sheer length of the campaign, the amount of money that was spent on it, the fundraising itself. I mean, all of us, journalists, my wife, who's not a journalist any longer, receiving endless fundraising messages on email, on telephones. Every 10 minutes her phone was buzzing with another for funds. It's all added to this notion of tension and unease here.
And it's all about the aftermath. One of the big worries was the country was so divided that whatever the outcome, there would be potentially violence on the streets, there would be a lot of division. What sense do you have, it's only been a few days, but what sense do you have of the aftermath?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, there's a building down there that is a commercial building that just a couple of days ago was ringed with fencing because the owners of the building were worried that, like the White House and the Vice President's residence, it could get ransacked and looted in the event of violence. That has all suddenly dissipated because really of the size of the victory. I mean, I think that this town particularly is despondent. It's a Democratic Party stronghold. there are thousands, probably tens of thousands of people here who realize they're not going to be able to stay here, partly because Donald Trump wants to replace them with ideologues, and partly because, in every time there's a transition, the Republicans are coming to town, the Democrats in large measure are leaving. But I think the shock to the system of the size of the victory, the one outcome of this election that no one thought was likely was a Trump landslide. Democrats said they thought a Kamala Harris landslide might happen. Most people thought narrow win for Kamala Harris, narrow win for Donald Trump, days, weeks of tension, possible unrest, possible protest. Nobody thought it's going to be a Donald Trump landslide and it will be resolved within hours of polls closing. And that's where we are, and the Democrats have said they're going to engage in a peaceful transition. And I think that mostly in this town there will be despondency, especially when we get to January, and we're going to see some very uncomfortable imagery relating to Democrats leaving the White House, the Republicans arriving. I mean, it'll be not entirely dissimilar, I suspect, to when Donald Trump came visiting the White House after his first election win, and there's this iconic picture of Obama staffers gathered on the lawn watching Trump arrive, and they all look like absolute death warmed up. And I think we're going to see similar imagery this time around.
Have you had a chance to talk to any of Donald Trump's detractors? People like
Yes.
John Bolton, who, was terrified of, to some degree, terrified of a Trump
Yes.
victory, because he said, now this time, as you alluded to in the first part of this, that he really has a better idea of what he can do. And how have those detractors, some of them have to run for the hills according to the threats.
Well, some of them have already left town. I know of two detractors, both of whom are not in Washington, D.C. One had already decided to leave the city some years ago and just get out of Dodge altogether, and the other one of whom deliberately positioned themselves overseas during election week because they were worried about what might happen. And in the aftermath of election week is suggesting that they are going to decouple themselves from the United States and establish themselves overseas instead. I think there is going to be an awful lot of that. And I think it will be because some people physically fear their own safety. And I think it is also because lots of other people will realize that their ability to build their careers here and pay their bills and look after their families is going to be heavily constrained as a result of the outcome of this election. So they're, in many cases, looking overseas. I was talking to a friend in London earlier today who was telling me that he works for a firm that has a department that deals with expats that is apparently overrun in the last 48 hours with requests from Americans for more information about how they can move and rebase themselves in the UK. So I think you're going to see a lot of movement.
What about those who suddenly seem to side with Donald Trump, RFK Jr.,
Absolutely.
Elon Musk? Those were kind of surprise twists.
Opportunity knocks, doesn't it? Jeff Bezos, who stopped the Washington Post here from publishing an endorsement of Kamala Harris and sent Donald Trump congratulations messages over Elon Musk's social media platform yesterday. Opportunity knocks, absolutely. Elon Musk definitely going to play some role in government. I think not in a cabinet position, because to do that he'd have to divest himself from his business interests, which seems extremely unlikely. But he's clearly going to be a Trump whisperer. RFK Jr., there is talk about becoming the Secretary of Health and Human Services. Some in Trump world have denied that's the plan, but RFK Jr. keeps fueling the notion. You're going to see ideologues and some of these external figures, these characters that have attached themselves to Donald Trump like a barnacle, playing a role in the administration. I think it's absolutely vital to underscore that Trump 2.0 is not going to look anything like Trump 1.0. First Trump Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, lovely man, foisted on him by Condoleezza Rice because she said, you need a man who understands the world. Rex Tillerson, this guy from Exxon, he'll sort you out. There's going to be none of that. General Jim Mattis, James Comey at the FBI, they're not going to work with any of these people. And that's going to change the character of this city.
Having seen how tight the polls were literally up to the end, the landslide victory was, of course, that much more of a surprise. To what degree do you think it might say something about America not being ready for a woman president, as they keep saying, possibly even not one of colour?
There's no question that that was a factor. I think there are multiple factors in the Democrats' demise in this election, but misogyny and racism was clearly a substantial issue. Barack Obama himself identified particularly the racist aspect of it when he went on the campaign trail and said that black men particularly he was hearing and believing were saying that they were not ready for a black woman in power. I think the misogyny issue is strong. I'm not sure it's as strong as it was in 2016 when Hillary Clinton lost her race, but it's definitely still a factor. But the Democrats' drubbing was so comprehensive that it's about more than that. In 2020, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris won 81 million votes. 4 years later, Kamala Harris and Tim Walz won 66 million votes. That's 15 million people who have decided they don't want to vote Democratic this time round. Some of them may have racist reasons for doing that. Some of them may have misogynistic reasons for doing that. Bernie Sanders says a lot of them are members of the working class who feel that the Democratic Party has abandoned them, so they're going to abandon the Democratic Party. We know that many of them are Latino voters who are American citizens from Latino families who are hostile to the new wave of illegal immigrants coming into the country because they argue they pulled themselves up by their own bootstraps, did everything the way you were supposed to do it legally, and they support the deportation of some of these illegal immigrants. So I think that the question for the Democratic Party now is elemental. I mean, clearly so many things went so wrong, even including how long it took to put the arm on Biden to get him to abandon his re-election quest, that there's no one thing you can fix or blame. You can't say it's just misogyny or it's just racism. It is a whole packet of problems that the Democratic Party didn't see coming.
You know, Simon, there was a lot of talk about uniting the country after the election. I certainly know I come here frequently and I sense the tensions and the divisions. Do you see any, as someone who's covered so much of this going on, do you see any signs there might be a move towards unity?
I mean, they always talk of a move towards unity after every election. And by the time the cadences of the sentence have finished echoing around the room that you're in, those calls have gone nowhere and are going to go nowhere. This is a tribal, 50-50 polarized nation. And there is nothing that the outcome of this election or Donald Trump's arrival in the White House said yesterday is going to heal the nation, said that before, then he came and made the inaugural speech about carnage in America. There's no fixing it. These are two tribal groups of followers of the Democratic Party and the new Trump-dominated Republican Party, with disaffected Republicans in the middle, not quite sure where they're going to end up. And finding common cause between any of these people is going to be difficult, and it's going to be increasingly difficult because it's geographical, right? I mean, there are places where Republicans feel comfortable and at home, and there are places where Liberal Democrats feel comfortable and at home, and the twain don't often mingle and meet. And I think there's a fundamental problem to the concept of a homogeneous society in one nation here, because it increasingly doesn't exist.
Well, of course, all the factions came out during the campaigning. You saw the Arab Americans, Black Americans, and so on. The Arab American story was an interesting one. How many people actually decided to support Trump from the Arab American community? Some people believe it's because of the backlash due to the lack of action taken by the Biden administration with the Israel-Gaza conflict. And some just, I guess, feel that Donald Trump is going to be someone who represents them better. He's promised to stop all wars in a day, basically. But they're going to have to face the consequences of what he does or doesn't do now.
Yes, and remember that he's talked about possibly reimposing his Muslim travel ban, which is going to have an enormous community impact on the Arab American community. But, I mean, the Arab American community in this election played a fascinating role, because they essentially said to the Democratic Party, enough. For 3 election cycles now, Barack Obama has gone to all Democrats and said, you may be disappointed in what we've done. Perhaps we haven't delivered on the things that you wanted, but you've got to vote for us because we're better than this guy, right? The Arab American community and other Democrats, furious over Gaza, in this election said, no, we're not going there. We're not doing it again. Bill Clinton traveled to Michigan days before the election and said to the Arab American community, Kamala Harris has said she's going to do what she can do to end the war, and she's going to try and advance the prospects of peace through diplomacy. That ought to be enough. That was the phrase he used to Arab American voters. Get over it. It ought to be enough. And it wasn't enough. And they had Jill Stein in Michigan, third-party candidate, appealing for their support. You can deny Kamala Harris the White House by voting for me if you don't want to vote for Donald Trump. And it proved to be effective. And I think that message to Democrats is a broader message than one that's just coming from the Arab American community. You can't keep saying, vote for us, because you may not like us very much, and we may have disappointed you, but we're still better than the alternative. They have to go back into the kitchen and cook up a better proposition than that for 2028.
Having followed all the promises, and of course they are just campaign promises, what are you expecting to occur in this coming year, for example, well, say post-January in 2025, when it comes to Russia-Ukraine and to Israel-Gaza?
Well, let's do Russia-Ukraine first. He's going to force Volodymyr Zelensky to make peace with Vladimir Putin and to give up parts of eastern Ukraine and Crimea. I mean, I think everybody understands that. The Europeans understand that. President Zelensky understands that. Vladimir Putin certainly understands that. He wants it done and dusted. And this is not just Trump, but the key figures that surround him in the foreign policy field say, we need to get this sorted out because we don't want to be obsessively involved in European security. We want to focus our attention on China. Europe's got to look after its own affairs. And the first plank of that is we sort out Ukraine. And the only way you sort out Ukraine is by pulling American military support and forcing Zelensky to make peace. So I think that's relatively clear. On Gaza, Trump and Netanyahu have been talking all the time. They've been speaking in recent days. Before the election, they were talking, with reports that Donald Trump said to Benjamin Netanyahu, get the military action in Gaza wrapped up by the time I take over in the Oval Office, because then it's got to be all about the day after, resolving Gaza in whatever way you can, getting the hostages out, become a big problem for any occupant of that White House if there are still American citizens being held hostage by Hamas in Gaza. But for the Trump administration, it's all about the Abraham Accords. It's all about expanding them, trying to bring about the normalization in ties between Israel and Saudi that many here in Washington believe the Hamas attacks of October the 7th was designed to derail. And so they want to get that Saudi track moving. And the way they think they do that is by ending the violence in Gaza, moving to the day after, which is obviously the really complicated bit, while simultaneously using the communication channels that they opened up through the Abraham Accords to try and get back to a place where you can think about the normalization of ties between Tel Aviv and Riyadh. That's what he's going to go for. It will obviously be incredibly complicated and difficult to get there.
Simon, to wrap up, with 8 elections now under your belts, do you ever see a third party emerging in the US? It seems like the idea of a third voice just completely disappeared this time.
I thought you were going to ask me if I've got a 9th one in me.
Yeah, well, there is that as well.
To which the answer is I'm not sure. A third party is so difficult here because the Republicans and the Democrats, we talk about them being the two big political parties. They're not just political parties. They are money machines. And one of the most amazing things about this election has been the fundraising. This has been a $10.5 billion election. Kamala Harris raised a war chest of $1 billion and was still asking for money from Americans even as the election got underway. So for a third party truly to catch fire, it's got to have big money behind it and national organizational heft. And that's why the genius, in a way, of Donald Trump was not to launch a third party. It was to take over the Republican Party and completely retool it from the inside. And that ultimately may be what some Democrats out there want to do with the Democratic Party. But to do that, you've got to say goodbye to Nancy Pelosi. She's a major cash provider through her fundraising capacities to the Democratic National Committee. The Obamas, obviously amazing fundraisers. You're going to have to take the reins of the party and then retool it, much as Donald Trump has done with the Republican Party, because launching a third party here is just so incredibly difficult. The climb is too steep.
It's frightening, isn't it? It's all about the money now.
It's absolutely all about the money, 100%.
Simon Marks, let's hope you get a ninth election in you, because I'd love to come back and talk to you.
Thank you, Riz.
Cheers. Well, my next guest is the Palestinian-American political analyst Omar Baddar. I wanted to get his perspective on the role of Arab-American voters during the elections, as well as the likely impact of a second Donald Trump presidency on the wars in Gaza and Lebanon. Omar, it's been a few months since we last had a chance to chat, and a lot has changed. What are your expectations in terms of US foreign policy under a second Trump presidency?
You know, it's extremely unpredictable. If it's going to be anything like the first Trump presidency, we are looking at a situation of complete and total chaos in the region. Trump, the first time he came along, promised that American policy is going to be even more pro-Israel than it already was. And that meant recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital, endorsing Israeli settlement expansion in the Palestinian territories, endorsing Israel's takeover of the Golan Heights in Syria, moving the embassy, and the list goes on of just letting Israel do whatever it wants and basically giving diplomatic cover to whatever Israel wanted to do. And at this point, we're right now witnessing a scale of Israeli atrocities in Gaza, in the West Bank, and in Lebanon that is really unprecedented. And Trump's promise that he's going to be even more pro-Israel right now is frankly terrifying, because it's difficult to imagine how much more pro-Israel it can get compared to the Biden administration that has given Israel a carte blanche to do whatever it wants to as well.
And yet, one of his campaign promises, I will end all wars, and he says he can end it in a day. That contradicts that.
Yeah, it is a complete and obvious contradiction, and it's obvious that Trump does not really care much. All of it is campaign rhetoric, and he's frankly himself unpredictable as well. So it's not really clear in which direction he's going to move once he actually comes into office. But there is an obvious contradiction between this idea that he's going to let Israel, quote unquote, finish the job, and also being the anti-war candidate. Those things don't go together. Israel's project is one of endless war, trying to wipe out Gaza, trying to completely ethnically cleanse the northern part of it, and now stuck in Lebanon, also in a quagmire that does not have any positive horizon on the future where you can actually end that conflict, because we're entrenched in a situation in which Israel is demanding complete and total submission from Hezbollah in Lebanon, and that is simply not going to be in the cards in the coming months.
There is that grey area of a few weeks between the actual election result and the inauguration, and it's still the Biden presidency until then. What chance is there, considering these possible contradictions, these possible twists, that the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu could use this as an opportunity to scale things up until the Trump presidency is intact?
Yeah, I think we are already watching that actually unfold, where Netanyahu has escalated the violence in North Gaza in a very, very significant way, taking advantage of the fact that there's simply not going to be any major American policy interventions right now. Biden is towards the end of his presidency, and there is an anticipation of what Trump might do. And even with the uncertainty of what Trump brings with him, this is certainly the moment for Israel to try to do as much damage as possible, to try to capture as much land as possible, and to basically carry out in a fashion where the international community and the United States, particularly as the patron state that needs to sign off on whatever Israel does, is simply not going to be present in any meaningful way. So you can effectively say that Netanyahu is in charge of American foreign policy for this period, as far as the region is concerned, and is free to do whatever he wants.
Isn't there also, though, an argument that this is a window for Joe Biden to perhaps get a last-minute boost to his legacy by saying, well, you know, he's got nothing to lose by actually pushing very aggressively?
This assumes that Biden has the cognitive ability to actually do what's good for him. If he had that, he would have done policy very, very differently on Palestine and Israel for a very long time. Certainly, this would be an opportunity, but I have absolutely no confidence that Joe Biden is in any shape right now to try to think about what that legacy looks like, and the desperate moral imperative of putting a stop to this onslaught in Gaza and being on record as the person who actually put an end to it. He doesn't seem to be interested in that. And frankly, I don't think he has the mental faculty to really intervene at this point in a way that would save his legacy, in addition to the endless lives of Palestinians.
Even if he did, I presume that it's really up to Benjamin Netanyahu to concur.
Yeah,
which doesn't seem to be the case.
It's we've had all this talk constantly about Biden being upset with Netanyahu, being frustrated with Netanyahu, refusing to meet with him. But at the end of the day, as long as American military funding and diplomatic protection continues unabated, then Netanyahu has no reason to take any of these concerns seriously. They're simply just rhetoric. And right now, for Biden to actually step up to a level where he's willing to threaten U.S. military funding for Israel based on Israel's behavior just seems really implausible. But frankly, it might be the only thing that would change Israel's behavior in the meantime. apart from suffering a devastating defeat in a regional conflict that looks like it's about to spiral completely out of control as well.
I'll get onto that in a moment, but since we spoke in mid-March, things really have gotten even worse in Gaza. Could you have predicted it to reach this kind of level? And where does this leave the idea of any real ceasefire?
I don't think anybody could have seen how bad things were going to get into Gaza. I think the entire world operated on the idea that we would not witness a full-scale genocide with the world being silent and not intervening to stop it. And yet this is precisely what we have witnessed, is that we've had over a year of this, entire families being wiped out and children being starved to death. We are watching this on our TVs day in and day out. And yet the United States is ensuring that there is no intervention that would put an end to this. And yeah, it is insane that we have allowed things to reach this level. And at this point, I think there is simply no end in sight. We're finally at the point where I'm realizing, at least, that there is no red line for Israel, period, that they can actually go as far as they want to. And it's really going to be a matter of how things devolve in the region rather than the US playing the role that they have always intended to play. They've always talked about playing. The US as a leader of democracy and human rights and values and freedom and all of that, it's just has been utterly dismantled by US embrace of the extremist and fanatical policies of the Israeli government at this point, that I don't see a prospect for a change.
And it's become even worse with Lebanon now being roped into it, and you couldn't really predicted that at the time, or could you?
I mean, look, Lebanon, it felt inevitable. Frankly, I was one of the few people who was tweeting long before things escalated that this was inevitable. You have a setup where the only way out of that confrontation spiraling out of control would have been a ceasefire in Gaza. That is the only way that you would have put an end to it. And once it became clear that the US has no interest in stepping in to achieve that ceasefire, to rein Israel in and put an end to this onslaught, then what was happening in Lebanon was absolutely inevitable. Because Hezbollah was determined that they were not going to stop what they were doing until the war on Gaza ends and until the onslaught and the genocide there comes to an end. And from Israel's perspective, they have a deterrence capacity that they're super invested in preserving. For them, the entire way that Israel can function in the region is through a relationship of regional dominance and dominance by force. So Hezbollah constantly engaging in these cross-border skirmishes it was inevitable that Israel was going to overreact at some point and go all in. And right now, of course, they are stuck in a situation where they can't win. They can cause immense damage to Lebanon from the air. But in order to defeat Hezbollah, you would need to send ground troops basically into Lebanon. And that fight is not going well for Israel at all. Hezbollah is able to inflict significant damage on Israel on the ground. And we are stuck in Israel is stuck in a quagmire where, sure, Lebanon is suffering the heavier end of the devastation given Israel's aerial power. But this is also not a situation that Israel can extract itself from with any kind of victory. I think they're going to be stuck in there also for a long time, unless there is a bigger intervention from the world to put an end to this.
Well, there's often that discussion of a 3H axis, the Houthis, Hezbollah, and Hamas. And there's also the belief, I guess, and I'd like your opinion on this, that Israel can only stretch itself so far.
Yeah, I think that is absolutely correct. They already have their hands completely full with Hezbollah. I think they thought that by decapitating the leadership and the pager attack, they've done a few things at the very beginning that were absolutely devastating to Hezbollah, but I think they underestimated the resilience of that movement, that it's bigger than a handful of leaders. Even if you decapitate the leadership, the ideological commitment of a very significant portion of Lebanon that built this drive towards fighting for Israel as a result of Israeli occupation of Lebanon in the past. They remember what that is like, and that is a very heavily motivated population that is not going to put up with a reoccupation of Lebanon or with any kind of Israeli dominance and Israel dictating to Lebanon how it's going to behave. They're going to face very, very significant resistance going into that. So the Houthis, I think, are much farther away and much weaker in a sense. They're causing trouble primarily for them in terms of access to their, southern harbor. But that, in terms of a direct military confrontation, Hezbollah is where it's at. And potentially this bigger escalation with a direct confrontation with Iran, I think, would be absolutely devastating for the region. It has really untold consequences. And that, I think, is the really worrying sign, is there doesn't seem to be enough intervention to make sure that does not escalate out of control, because the tit for tat is ongoing and we're all anticipating what the Iranian response is going to be in the coming days.
I want to touch briefly on the ruling of the International Court of Justice that basically Israel is heading towards, it was the way it's phrased is kind of delicate, but the word genocide came up, which caused a lot of upset for pro-Israel supporters, obviously. What were your thoughts when South Africa took that step? A very bold step.
It was an extremely bold step on the part of South Africa, and an impressive one given the fact that South Africa has nothing to gain from doing this. It's obvious that the international order is ruled by the United States for the most part, and people who are looking for their own interests would stop short of crossing certain lines. When you go after Israel with a genocide charge at the International Court of Justice, obviously that's the kind of thing that's going to shake up a significant portion of the world against you. But it was absolutely a moral imperative, and I think given their history and knowing about Israeli support for apartheid during the apartheid era in South Africa may have been part of the motivating factor. Nelson Mandela and Desmond Tutu and many others talked about this common struggle between South Africans and Palestinians and enduring very similar conditions. And I think that was part of why they acted with that kind of boldness. And it's a charge that frankly sticks for a simple reason. You have people like Arya Nair, who himself a Holocaust survivor, his family fled the Holocaust, started Human Rights Watch, headed the ACLU, very mainstream Jewish figure who fought for civil rights in general and for Jewish rights in particular. And he's come to the conclusion that what Israel is committing in Gaza is also a genocide. The credibility of that charge is really obvious for anybody who's not afraid to cross that line. It seems that everybody's squeamish about touching it for political reasons. But when you look at the scale of devastation in Gaza, when you look at the amount of destruction, the number of families that have been completely wiped out, and Gaza's inability to sustain life, at this point, I think this is really the only word that you can use to describe what is unfolding.
On that point, UNRWA, the UN Works and Relief Agency, is also facing the issue of now being blocked. Considering it's shifted so heavily into this humanitarian crisis, what impact do you expect from that?
Yeah, it's been absolutely devastating. I think with and without UNRWA in the short term, Israel is making it very clear that they are going to prevent Gaza from being able to sustain life in any way. They've been blocking food aid left and right, really putting the entire population of Gaza under conditions that are just unlivable. And I think that UNRWA is more about the long-term strategy of trying to end the existence of Palestinian refugees. UNRWA is the reason why Palestinian refugees can survive, can actually live day by day, awaiting the right to return to their homes and to be able to go back to the homes that they have actually come from. And Israel is interested in dismantling they're interested in dismantling the entire Palestinian national movement for freedom. And part of that is going to be chipping down at UNRWA and the ability of Palestinian refugees to survive as well.
As we kind of wrap up, a couple of quick thoughts. Where did it go wrong as far as Arab American voters in the US election?
Arab American voters understand what a threat Trump poses, but they could not bring themselves to vote for a Democratic administration that has enabled genocide for an entire year and would not even say anything about being serious about putting an end to it. And that has really shifted things in a way that is, and what's also equally impressive about it is how savvy Trump was, that he went to Michigan selling himself as the pro-peace candidate, poking fun at the Democrats, at his opponent for campaigning with Liz Cheney and talking about how the Cheneys want to destroy the Middle East and invade every Arab and Muslim country and so on. It was a level of political savviness on the Trump administration. It is frankly shocking and shameful that the Democrats did not see what an opportunity they were wasting in taking a politically smart choice that is also morally a moral imperative to oppose genocide and to gain politically from it. Instead, they chose to be on the wrong side of history and pay a very dear political price for it domestically as well.
Last thought then, you alluded to this, the risk of a wider conflict in the Middle East.
I think what Trump does when he comes in is going to very quickly tell us which direction things are heading, but that is absolutely a very, very real and serious prospect. Both Iran and Israel are committed to escalation right now. Neither of them is willing to basically bow their head down and accept the other country's dominance. And that is on a trajectory where it's going to inevitably lead to a very, very major confrontation that could pull the United States in also directly. And the question is, does the US have that appetite? Because if the US is committed to not engaging directly, then they would absolutely have to put an end to the way Israel is behaving in the region. This rampage that Netanyahu has gone on for an entire year has to come to an end. And if President Trump does not actually put an end to it, then it seems like it is actually inevitable. And we are looking at a scale of a regional conflagration that could not figuratively, but literally kill millions of people in the region. We are talking about a war that, with just the rocket arsenal that Iran has, the regional allies that they have, you're talking about the entire region being set ablaze, and it's a very, very dangerous situation.
Omar, we'll speak again, I'm sure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now let's get more on the political post-mortem with Matt Duss. He was the main foreign policy advisor to Democratic Senator Bernie Sanders. He's now Executive Vice President at the Center for International Policy. Matt Duss, thanks very much. I guess the first question is, where did the Democrats go wrong?
Well, I think, there's an anti-incumbent mood both here and around the world. This has been a year with a lot of elections in democratic countries, and incumbents have not done well. There's a general mood of just dissatisfaction and kind of questioning and a lot of hostility toward, the system or the establishment. And I think that's what we saw here. That's not to say that these concerns and this anger is not legitimate. I think it is. I think despite the fact that a lot of the economic indicators show that the American economy is in pretty good shape, a lot of people just aren't feeling that in their lives. The cost of living, the cost of basic goods, groceries, the cost of housing, these are rising. And clearly, American voters punished the Democrats for that.
For many years, Bernie Sanders was seen as the voice of reason for those who couldn't find, equity with either side of the Republicans or Democrats. I guess those guys are now saying we should have listened to Bernie Sanders.
Well, I mean, for the longest time, he was not seen as the voice of reason. But after, I think, 2016, yes, as you said, it became clear that someone who was himself a critic of the system and of the establishment was making a lot of the same arguments. I don't want to compare him to Trump too much, but both of them had an anti-establishment critique. I think Bernie's was obviously more unifying, I think more positive and constructive. And yes, I think in the wake of this week's defeat for Democrats, I think a lot of people are saying Bernie is onto something. So I think the question is, will the party leadership have the wisdom to really rethink, to understand what they got wrong, and really embrace that more kind of populist economic message that I think Bernie and his movement and others in the kind of populist left of the Democratic Party have been pushing?
There's also going to be the issue of winning back the lost voters. It surprised a lot of people. We had Arab American voters going one way, Black American voters, Latino American voters. There seemed to be a massive focus on these different groups and how it all shifted.
Right. No, I think that's right. I mean, we talk about Arab American voters, and we cannot not talk about Gaza. But I think that's not just an Arab American issue. I think there are a lot of Americans, particularly young Americans, including Black Americans and others, for whom Gaza is bigger than just a foreign policy issue. The issue of Palestinian rights has become part of the kind of broader progressive social justice and racial justice agenda. But I think it's also in many ways a referendum on how America behaves in the world. You have a lot of Americans who have real questions about how America has operated American foreign policy over the past several decades. Obviously, the Iraq War was a huge turning point for a lot of people, but still to watch the United States for now over a year backing almost completely unconditionally this massacre, the killing of tens of thousands of people, the displacement of over almost 2 million, that is hard for a lot of people to take. And I think the idea that we were ever going to get people to kind of disassociate these things, I think was a fantasy. And again, this goes to whether the question now is whether the Democratic Party leadership is capable of really kind of assimilating these lessons.
Now, of course, Donald Trump will position it that he's won over all these voters. But to what degree was the Arab American pro-Trump vote really a backlash, simply an anti-Biden vote or anti-Biden administration vote?
I think it certainly was to some extent. I think it's also worth noting, I think a lot in the Arab American community, which in this country is largely Christian rather than Muslim, although we do have a growing Muslim population. I mean, Trump brought a social conservative message. I mean, he spoke to social and religiously conservative audiences in the Arab American community and in the Latino community. Obviously, the evangelical community is very strongly pro-Trump, so I think that's a part of it as well.
So many nations around the world have had women leaders. To what degree was this a major setback for the idea of a woman U.S. president?
Yeah, I don't want to ever underestimate the element of sexism and misogyny that still certainly exists in our society. But I also don't want to overinterpret it that way. I think had Kamala Harris had a better message, had she done more work to kind of articulate a policy vision, and frankly had more time to run as the actual candidate, I think she was handicapped by both the kind of short amount of time she had to kind of get her campaign going, also the fact that she is the sitting vice president. So it was a little bit tough for her to distinguish herself from the president with whom she was still working. So I think all of those things hindered her as well.
Does she have a chance to re-enter the race at some point in the future?
I think it's probably unlikely. I think it's very rare, certainly in modern times, to see a candidate who ran and lost to come back. But I would not count it out completely, but I think it's very unlikely.
Matt, how did America become so divided?
It's been a long time coming, but I think there's a lot of reasons for it. I think growing inequality. I think the fact that a lot of Americans are struggling, they see others doing much better. They feel that the system is unfair. They see privileges and wealth accruing to a very small elite. They've become cynical about the ability of government and of basic politics to deliver policy change that impacts them. And amid that frustration, and this is historically true, people will become more susceptible to demagogues who offer them a place, to point that anger, people to blame, whether it's immigrants, whether it's minorities, whether it's foreign enemies. We can go back to times throughout history where we've seen this repeatedly happening. So that's why I think it's going to be very important for Democrats to offer a better vision of how we are actually the party that can help make your lives better in a way that does not simply displace that anger onto disfavored minorities.
To some degree, this level of polarization in America, it seems unprecedented, and it doesn't feel like it could be something that's healed that quickly. Is this something now going to be generational, this divide, or could this message of unity that the candidates kept putting out actually be achieved?
Right. Well, historically, we were pretty polarized. It led to the Civil War. I hope it will not lead to that again. I hope there will be a way for us to kind of reconstruct a shared concept of the American political project, because that's where we're at right now. We have, a really closely divided country, and who have, two sides that have quite different visions of what it means to be an American, what America is for, who is really an American and who is not. And I think the work, so I would agree, it is probably generational, to do the work, to kind of reach across and talk to people with whom we disagree, people with whom, who have ideas that we might find offensive, and yet with whom we share this country. But that is the task ahead of us.
I think this election, certainly for an international audience, brought up the term swing states more than ever. And I think it surprises people that there can be such a geographical division within the US.
Yeah, and I have to apologize to colleagues around the world who are required to pay such close attention to our elections and our swing states and our bizarre electoral college, because it does impact them. Again, this is something I think it's important for Americans to keep in mind. This election, the outcome of our elections, impacts people around the world who have no say in those elections. And I think there are several battleground states. Trump won most, if not all of them. But I think it's because there are, both sides have their own electoral map, their, so-called path to victory. And clearly Trump's path was the better one this time.
John Bolton, who was the former US ambassador to the UN and then became Donald Trump's national security advisor, and then fell out with him very badly, commented that his worry was a second Donald Trump presidency would allow Donald Trump, having realized what he could and couldn't do in the first one, to have much more power and much more focus on what he would do this time. What changes do you expect with the second Trump presidency?
Yeah, well, I think, I don't agree with John Bolton on a lot, but I do think he's right. I think Trump, in the 4 years of his first administration, Trump learned that you need to have people who are loyal to you. You need to have people who are willing to execute what you want. And I think he's done some work over these past years, clearly, to assemble a crew and a team that is more likely to do that. I mean, I think there are, in certain areas of the world, it depends what we're talking about. I think he will continue the work of the first administration. But what's interesting about this is, in a lot of areas, the Biden administration continued the work, or at least the direction of the Trump administration, starting with the focus on China, which has been the driving kind of imperative of American foreign policy, beginning with Trump. Biden has picked that up, but I think he stayed on the right side rhetorically, being careful not to, demonize Chinese or Asian Americans in a way that Trump certainly did. In the Middle East as well, too. I mean, with a few exceptions, Biden essentially carried forward what Trump was trying to do in the Middle East. And again, a lot of it driven by China, but the embrace of the Abraham Accords, seeing this as a kind of workable security and stability arrangement for the region, despite the cost and repression for the region's people. And the last thing I would say is, part of what 2016 showed us, and this is where I go back to what Bernie Sanders brought as well, was this sense that so many Americans, this system is not working for them. Our economic system, our trade system, our foreign policy. And so I think, what we did see from Biden, and this is one of the most important things, was the kind of move away from the old neoliberal kind of corporate-led global trade order. And I think there were very important steps taken to kind of try and define a new economic order that invests in American jobs, tries to rebuild American industry. But it's very easy to see how that could kind of evolve very quickly into kind of a new, trade blocks, trade war. And that is what we're going to likely see from Trump.
Now, one thing, the BRICS, or BRICS Plus nations, as they've come up to be now, are a growing strength, growing strong bloc. It sounds like Donald Trump is willing to poke the bear, so to speak, in creating greater division, especially with China and perhaps with India even. What is this going to do to America's position on the world stage, particularly with trade? Yeah.
I mean, first off, I think, yes, we are already farther into a multipolar era than I think many people in Washington would like to admit. The United States obviously still enormously powerful, still has a set of partnerships and alliances that are really unmatched, yet our relative share of power is diminishing. Relative to China, relative to some of the countries, the BRICS countries that you mentioned. And I think Donald Trump has an inherent suspicion of multilateralism. We saw this goes back to his understanding of how you do business deals. He prefers kind of bilateral business deals. It's like me and you sit down and we work this out. So I think that is going to kind of undergird his attempt to kind of stoke divisions, not only in kind of alliances of adversaries, but also within alliances of allies as well.
Well, the two key factors, I guess, that could position America in the new era, apart from trade, is conflicts. And it seems that America might end up in a very difficult position when it comes to blocs taking sides, when it comes to Israel, Gaza, and also Ukraine, Russia. Can Donald Trump stop conflicts in a day, as he promises?
Right. I mean, I think, Donald Trump, I think he's shown a willingness, he uses this kind of recklessness and kind of unpredictability. And again, it looks very different when you're doing it as a real estate mogul versus president of the United States. But unfortunately, he seems to take the same approach regardless. But we did see, in his first term, that even though I think his approach led us to the brink of conflict several times, like particularly with North Korea and then later with Iran, when he's faced with the possibility of really open conflict, he has stepped back. So I think there is something in his understanding that even though he's going to use the idea of conflict to try and get a better deal, he may act rationally in that moment. Now, I think we got lucky in both of those cases. We may not get lucky again, and I think that's what's very concerning, because once you go down this path, once violence really starts to erupt, it can spiral very quickly.
What do you expect his relationship under a second presidency to be with NATO?
Yeah. I mean, I would not expect him to withdraw from NATO at the outset, but I do think he's made his views on NATO clear, and that he feels that we are getting taken for a ride. I mean, we're getting ripped off is kind of Trump's kind of general argument, and that has a lot of appeal to Americans who have questions about, the role that America has played as a sort of global security guarantor. Are we getting a benefit in comparison to how much we are paying for other security? Now, I think there is a good argument that Americans have benefited enormously from this arrangement. But Trump, particularly with NATO, the way he talks about it, I mean, I still don't know if he understands how NATO works. He seems to think that European allies pay up to us instead of like paying into their own defense. But I think, and I expect, if they didn't start to get their act together the first time, I would hope the Europeans have gotten the message now that they do need to start to think a lot more seriously about looking to their own defense. Because as I said, I don't think Trump's going to pull out of NATO immediately, but I think he's definitely going to be making noise about this. And I'll be interested to see how our European allies respond.
On the issue of the climate and climate change, he seems to be a climate change denier to many and pushing obviously the fossil fuel agenda. I wonder how that will affect his relationship with countries like the Middle East, which, if anything, are trying to transition away from it.
Yeah, it's a problem. I mean, for Trump, it seems very basic. He just thinks that, renewable energy and believing in climate change is bad for business. That's what it comes down to for him. And I think, the way that Biden has approached it, when he's, the way he says, when I hear climate change, I think green jobs, I think more jobs. That's the better way to approach it. But yeah, I think as we saw in the first term when Trump pulled out of the Paris Climate Accord, I think unfortunately we're going to see a rollback of a lot of these really important steps that were taken under the Biden administration to really starting investing in renewable energy and make a transition.
A final thought. One of my guests on my show said one of the issues that one of the issues with Donald Trump is that he thinks of himself as a president, as ruler of America, not as someone who serves American citizens as an elected leader. Is that agenda, being the ruler of America, likely to really play in?
I think so. I mean, clearly, this is, you see this in the way he's very clearly kind of admiring of more powerful dictators, whether it's Putin, whether it's Xi, leaders of other countries who have a lot more, authority to act as they want and have, populations under their control. He feels that, he felt that the first time. Now that he's been reelected, he will certainly feel it even more so. So I think we're going to see that reflected in the way he governs.
Especially with the House on his side now and changing the justice system.
That's right. This is going to be Trump unleashed.
Matt Duss, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And that's all for this special edition of the show, coming to you from Washington, D.C. From me and the team, thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.